Welcome back. In this section, we're going to talk about another one of the more common operational management pieces that most IT managers and directors need to think about if they were only focusing on on-prem services. But even in the world of the cloud, you're going to need to focus on them as well, and that's automation and configuration. And in this particular section, we're going to talk about the Azure Automation Service, what things it can provide, such as runbooks, how you can edit and test those runbooks. Runbooks are a way for you to write your own scripts to do things within your environment. Some of the assets that can be used within those runbooks as well as within configuration management. How to kick off a runbook. There's a number of different ways. The most common way is to set up a schedule, but there are also, you can do webhooks and things of that nature. And then configuration management as a service, which is available through Azure Automation as well. How can you leverage a DSC pull server, a PowerShell DSC pull server that Azure provides to you out of the box rather than you having to deploy your own. And then we'll go through some example PS runbooks, PowerShell runbooks, as well as some DSC scripts, and really spend a little bit of time on what kinds of things are possible within the scope of Azure Automation. But in this particular video, we're going to focus on what Azure Automation is, what the service can provide, how it is hybrid capable, and can therefore help you provide an automation service for both your on-prem environment as well as your cloud environment. And of course, we'll talk about what an Azure Automation account is. That is the primary resource that will get created inside of Azure to get you started. We'll talk about the basics of runbooks as well as desired state configuration, which is the configuration management as a service. So let's head on over into the portal and we'll get started. Okay, so we're back in the portal, and to get things started, we're going to take a look at Azure Automation accounts. And the Azure Automation account provides both runbook capabilities as well as desired state configuration or configuration management as a service. Let's go through the process of actually creating one, and then we'll dive into an overview of what all is actually inside of the account. So we'll go ahead and we'll click Create. Now, there isn't really a lot of information that's required when you create a new Azure Automation account, because at the end of the day, an Azure Automation account is really nothing more than a holder of scripts, as well as how to execute those scripts. So in the case of runbooks, it's a set of PowerShell scripts, or also now are supported Python. And then how are you going to actually kick off those scripts? Is it done through a webhook? Is it done through a schedule? Things like that. But then also some additional pieces that would allow you to edit that runbook, test that runbook, audit that runbook. From a configuration management perspective, it is just a holder of desired state configuration scripts, which are still PowerShell, but they define what a VM should look like, what services should be started, what software should be installed, maybe registry keys that are set or removed, things like that. And then providing a way for those VMs to pull those scripts as they are continually updated to make sure that the VMs are meeting the configuration management state that you have as a requirement. So at the end of the day, an Azure Automation account is really just a holder of those scripts and then a way to purvey those scripts out to the VMs within your architectures, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud. So I'm just going to give this a name here, call it Packed Automation. Of course, I'm going to put it into my Packed Publishing resource group that I always have. It's going to automatically default to the South Central. Now, the next thing is important, and I do want to talk about this, which is why I'm walking through the wizard with you. Inside of Azure Automation, there is the concept of connections, and we're going to talk about them when we go into assets a couple of videos from now. But I at least want to talk about them here. One of those assets, as I said, is called connections. What connections provide is basically a system user, what we call in Active Directory world a service principal, which is you can think of as a background system user, a user that has a role, has permissions, and the ability to do things inside of Azure, but does not require a interactive login. They have a password, they have an ID, but they are not really truly a user. And if you want to do anything inside of Azure and do it in an automated fashion, then you're going to need these service principal accounts. Now, what this Create Azure Run As account is doing is it is creating a service principal user for you behind the scenes that you can then pull into your Azure scripts inside of Azure Automation to have them run automatically, not require any kind of user interaction to put in a password or things of that nature. And I highly recommend that you go ahead and do this. Now, I do want to caution you, because when it creates this service principal user behind the scenes, it is giving them administrative access. It is giving them the administrator role just like you have inside of your subscription. So certainly for testing, development purposes, it works fantastic. But when you actually go to put some of these scripts into production, specifically runbooks more so than desired state configurations, then you're going to want to create a separate service principal user and assign it a role that has only the permissions that it needs to be able to do its job. So I did want to talk about that. For the purposes of these videos, I am going to go ahead and let it create the Azure Run As account, and then I'll be using that Run As account inside of my scripts later. So let me go ahead and click Create. Those are the only pieces of information that are needed to create a new account, because remember, as I said, an account is nothing more than a holder of scripts and a purveyor of those scripts to your architecture. So as soon as the account has been created, we'll come back and we'll do a dive into the Azure Automation account. And we've now got our Azure Automation account. We'll go ahead and click Go to Resource. Now you'll notice that I actually got two different items here inside of my notifications. One, it did create the Azure Automation account, but you'll notice it also has two separate notifications for the Run As accounts, or the service principals. And actually you can see here that the notification says service principal in parentheses. So it did have to create those as two separate resources, but then made them available inside of Azure Automation as connection assets. And I'll show those to you in a second. So here is our Azure Automation account. This is the overview page. The overview page gives you the basic information, the name of the resource group, where it's located, things of that nature. But then it also gives you a nice little graph of the job statistics. So remember, I said that you can schedule these script files to run periodically, and that is considered to be a job. So every time a job executes, you'll actually get information about it here inside of the job statistics. And of course, you can click on this and actually go into it in more depth. Now, because of the fact that I have zeros here, there's nothing for you to actually see, but you could dive into this in more detail. The top sections are the same as we've been seeing throughout all of Azure. Access to the activity log specific to this resource, being able to provide access control. And of course, the access control area would give you a quick and easy way to set up service principals for Azure Automation as well. Now, the next areas, configuration management, is where you can actually set up the VMs that are going to be configured automatically through desired state configuration. DSC configurations is where you're going to actually upload your PowerShell DSC scripts, have them be validated, tested against, and then once they have been validated and tested against, then you can actually start to apply them to the VMs that have been configured. The top two items, inventory and change tracking, are brand new features. We'll talk about them very, very briefly here. Inventory basically says what is installed on the VMs that are set up for configuration management. Now, they have to have the agent installed on them for configuration management before they can provide this kind of information, but it allows you to, first of all, with inventory, see what has been loaded, what software is installed, what registry keys are put in, what's the file structure look like, things like that. Change tracking is what's happened. So if the Windows server has been updated recently, a new Windows update, someone installed a new piece of software, things of that nature, you would actually see that kind of information inside of change tracking. These are brand new services. They've just been released, and they're going to be built on top of over time to provide additional configuration and change management features within the Azure Automation account. Once again, though, you will need to have the configuration management agent that is part of Azure Automation to be installed on those VMs before these would actually work properly. And that can be done via the DSC nodes area. And we'll, of course, go into this in more detail in a later video when we cover configuration management in much more depth. So let's continue to scroll down. The next area is process automation. And process automation is where you actually start to work with those runbook scripts. Now, what exactly is a runbook? A runbook is nothing more than PowerShell. Now, that PowerShell can be defined as actual PowerShell script, just like we've been using in many of our videos up until now to be able to create resources inside of Azure, or they can actually be graphically defined as well. So you can actually see here, I pulled up, these are the runbooks that are created for you automatically when you create a new one. And you can see here that there is different icons next to each one. The icons that look like there's a hierarchy, that's actually a graphical runbook. And I'll show that to you in a second. The next one, this is the Python icon. So we actually now support Python as a scripting language inside of Azure Automation. The next one is the PowerShell. So actually being able to type in PowerShell and have it be used in an automated way. So let's take a look at these real quickly. The Azure Automation tutorial, this one is a graphical runbook. Now by default, if I dive into this, it just gives me information about the jobs, the schedules, the webhooks for this particular webhook and how it can be accessed. Jobs are scheduled jobs. You can create a new schedule, what jobs have been run, what jobs have been failed, what jobs have been succeeded, so on and so forth. You can also create a webhook, which is nothing more than a URL so that the runbook can be triggered by something. A very common example, and you might have seen this in the last video series during some of the demonstrations, where in monitoring or alerting, specifically our alerting service, you have the ability to trigger a webhook. And when you do that, you just type in the URL. And when you type in that URL, what will happen then is when the alert fires, it will actually call that webhook, thereby triggering the runbook inside of Azure Automation to actually start processing and doing whatever it is that it's supposed to do. And there are a number of different mechanisms inside of Azure that have webhook-based capability. Azure Functions is another one that's very commonly used, but Azure Automation is as well. So you get information about all of these kinds of things. You can get some description, some logging and tracing, all of the standard stuff that you would think of with respect to a script. But then let's look up here at the top where you can actually start a runbook right here manually. You can view it or edit it. And in this particular case, I'm going to view this one so that you can actually see there's no script here. There's absolutely no script here. All these are is a flow of boxes, and each one of these boxes corresponds to a PowerShell command. And you can actually see that it gets the run as connection, that service principal user. It logs into Azure with that service principal user. If it couldn't find it, it goes ahead and gives you an error. It then gets the Azure list of resource groups, specifically finds a set of resources, and then writes out the names and types of those resources. Very simple, but it's graphically defined rather than script defined. Now, if I go back, because we have that exact same script, but now in straight PowerShell. So let's take a quick view here. Exact same thing. Gets the connection name, does the necessary login here, which is add Azure RM account with that service principal information, does a catching of the error, and then starts to loop through the resource groups. And as it finds the resources inside of the resource group, it writes the output of that particular resource name and the resource type. So it's doing all of the same information, just 3 different ways of making this possible, all depending upon what's comfortable for you. And I can give you some great examples of stuff that I've done for customers, and I'll actually show you some. For example, one customer that I worked with, they wanted to automate the starting and stopping of their VMs. But they wanted to do it in a bit of a different way. Rather than do it based on resource group name, they wanted to do it based on tags, because they knew that the SQL servers needed to be up before the web servers, before the business application servers. and therefore they wanted to make sure that they were scheduled separately, but they were all part of the same resource group. So I actually created a script to do all of that. However, these guys were not PowerShell experts. They told me straight off the bat that, Brian, I'm not a PowerShell guy. Do not write this in PowerShell. I need this to be very easily editable for someone who is not a PowerShell expert. So I actually had to do all of that using the graphical editor. Even though I'm more comfortable as a developer myself doing it in PowerShell, I needed to do it so that the customer was more comfortable. And the same thing that I wrote in the graphical editor could also have just as easily been written in PowerShell as well as in Python. And actually, I probably could have gotten it done faster if I had done it in PowerShell. So these are some of the things that runbooks provide to you. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out here is within the scope of the runbook, not only can you start it, view it, or edit it, and we'll go into editing and testing in a later video. You can set up schedules for it here. And this has to be done on a per runbook basis. This is something for you to be aware of. You can set a webhook for it. Of course, you can delete it. You can export it. You can refresh it. Now, there's something else that I want to point back here as far as runbooks are concerned. You'll see there's a button up here called Browse Gallery. There is a PowerShell Gallery and specifically a PowerShell Runbook Gallery. And basically what it provides is it links to a couple of different repos out there that people will publish their scripts to. So let's click on that real quickly. We can filter this down to which specific source. There's the PowerShell Gallery, which is PowerShellGallery.com, or Script Center, which is a different URL, and I don't remember off the top of my head. I will make sure, of course, to provide these to you as additional links at the end of the section. But then you can also filter according to what are you looking for. Are you looking for PowerShell, graphical, workflow? Do you want this to be published from the Microsoft or from the community? So let's just go ahead and click OK and get everything. So here are some of the ones that come up right off the bat. Stopping and starting of Azure VMs. And you'll notice that they're separate. And it's because they need to be separate scripts. You can also tell by the icon, these are graphically oriented. Now you might be going, well, Brian, you just told me a story about how you created these for your customer. Yes, I did. However, these two scripts are based off of pulling resources in a resource group, and therefore starting and stopping them based on the resource group name. It did not provide the level of granularity to then go in and only start ones with a specific tag. And that was what I had to do for my particular customer. Here's the PowerShell version of the exact same ones. But then you can see there's a lot of different scripts here. Now, the majority of these are PowerShell, and that's because Python is a very newly supported language. But the great piece of this is, let me go back up to the top, and the stop Azure V2 VMs. It gives you a quick overview, a description. You can actually look at the graphical editor. Now, the one thing I will say is you cannot dive into each of these and look at the properties behind them, but you can import them directly into your Azure Automation account, thereby allowing you to now have them, recreate them, schedule them, set webhooks for them, and actually use them inside of your architecture here moving forward. Great way for you to get started with specific runbooks that already provide functionality that you're going to need from an automation perspective. Let's go back to the Azure Automation account. The last area I want to talk about is the shared resources, and this is basically the assets that I talked about. Now, the one in particular is the connections. We'll talk more detail about the assets later, but I did want to show you here are those connections that were created. You can see that they are, in fact, it is a Azure Service Principal user. There is the ID, the tenant ID, and these are the pieces of information that are actually used in order to log into Azure for these accounts. This is pretty much all that there is from an overview perspective of Azure Automation. I think it's already obvious that we can dive into this in a lot of detail, and I'm a very, very big fan of the Azure Automation service. I think it provides a tremendous amount of value, so I'm going to really enjoy diving deep into this. So let's head on over to the deck and we'll talk about what's coming next.